Okay, so your recent study highlights, I think, the decarbonisation strategy are increasingly shaped by practical constraints such as costs, regulation, and infrastructure. I guess it'd be good to understand how companies are balancing their ambitious sustainability goals with some of these, real world limitations, if you like.
Yes, I think our survey shows this year that it's not about retreating, but it's about thinking about where can progress be made, where there's economic feasibility, there's a strong investment case, and making sure that decisions are being taken considering both the decarbonisation pressures, but also resilience and sort of financial considerations as well. Um, I think it's there's also been more focus on risk. I think this year compared to other years where we've undertaken the study, so it's reflecting that there are quite a few headwinds around investments in particularly newer technologies, but still thinking about what are the opportunities to make progress in the next 3 to 5 years where perhaps things are more proven. There's already demand signals there. There's already the technology in place, and thinking about prioritizing those areas rather than necessarily the choices and the investments that are further out.
Okay, and I know utilities are prioritizing grid modernization, but there are a lot of potential obstacles there, things like permitting, just the supply chain, getting equipment in interconnection delays. Are there any particular strategies and or I guess technologies that are proving particularly effective when it comes to overcoming, some or all of those bottlenecks?
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, we see a huge investment in grid upgrading and the infrastructure requirements, as well as all the equipment and services that sit around that. So there is, firstly, I guess, this real recognition that grid modernization is super important. I think there have been some policy changes, particularly in certain countries, to change the way that some of the queues are handled, for example. So instead of it being first come, first served in the UK, it's now thinking about actually prioritizing depending on what grid connections are most strategic and most important. So that's quite a big shift. I think there's also quite a lot of innovation going into thinking around the workarounds. Some of this is short term, but some of it is also about thinking how can solutions have sort of independence from the grid as well. So our study this year showed that behind the meter solutions and microgrids are increasingly being used as a bridge. And this is not to replace the grid connection, but it's alongside it, particularly for things like data centers.
Okay, and I think it's fair to say concerns about reliability are rising for the utilities, and therefore there's greater investment in storage and dispatchable power. How are utilities evaluating again trade-offs between, shall we say, traditional reliability solutions and some of these innovative storage technologies, which maybe, if they're not unproven, they certainly haven't been around sort of long enough to be completely tried and tested, shall we say?
Yes, that's right. I think the energy mix by country is really important here, and each country needs its base load to have some stability. So for some countries, this might be gas. For other countries, it might be nuclear. And I think there's a recognition that that capacity is important to provide some stability. I think then the other area that's increasingly in focus is around storage. And as you say, some of the technology is still in development, but actually the attachment rates of renewable, whether it's solar or wind, being deployed alongside battery storage has really, really stepped up. And we know from the work that we do with a lot of IPPs that really it's now becoming increasingly common to not think about building out solar capacity in isolation, but to always be thinking about the solar plus battery storage sort of combination. So that's I think going to make a real difference to the reliability of renewables. And then it's making sure that there's still the solutions in place to treat extreme events or the peaks that can come about with data centers or other sources of high energy consumption.
Okay, and the oil and gas companies approaching energy transition cautiously, shall we say? And I know the climate at the moment is somewhat uncertain, shall we say, as to the levels of commitment, etc. But are there any particular transition related investments that for them are most likely to deliver sort of some good returns in the next decade? And again, if you're happy to comment, or have they slightly sort of drawn back from that transition owing to the political climate that we're seeing at the moment?
Yes, there certainly has been some drawing back, particularly in areas where their capabilities were not necessarily well aligned. And I think that that's something that's where the shift is coming. So the areas where they are still investing, I think there's a couple of ones to highlight. One is there is still an effort to think about lower carbon within oil and gas. So particularly gas, for example, and LNG is another example that's seeing a lot of investment to that build out. I think part of the role of gas is really, particularly in the US, for example, really being propped up by the load growth experienced from data centers. I think then there's an effort to think about, well, if oil and gas is going to persist for longer, then actually how can we decarbonize as much as we can as quickly as we can? So areas around efficiency, thinking about abatement of emissions, whether that's methane or looking at solutions around flare abatement, for example. Some of these are getting a lot of attention and really making sure that the operations are made as efficient as possible. I think the other area is that selectively, CCS is still likely to be an important part of the energy transition, and hydrogen as well in its places, particularly for the hard to abate sectors around heavy industry and fuels. So it is an important area. It's just making sure that it's really built on suitable use cases and making sure that the whole ecosystem is in place, as opposed to investing in hydrogen CCS without those value chain considerations.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I was going to come on to that. See, I think you pretty much answered, but are there particular barriers other than what you've described there that you can't do it sort of piecemeal? The whole infrastructure has to be ready. When it comes to CCS and alternative fuels like hydrogen, is the biggest barrier just building out the overall infrastructure, or is there anything else going on there?
Yes, I think what's challenging with CCS and hydrogen, for example, is really matching the supply and demand and doing it at sufficient cost. So sufficiently low cost, sorry. So if you take something like hydrogen, the transport costs are really significant. And so thinking about where does hydrogen make sense? Where is the infrastructure there? There's a lot of work going into making the gas pipelines hydrogen ready. And we're very supportive of, where possible, using existing infrastructure to really think about the mechanisms for these energy transition technologies, because that's where you're then going to you're more likely to make the economics work. I think with CCS, similarly, what's challenging around CCS is you've got different players that are involved from lots of different sectors, and they're often trying to solve this in isolation. Whereas actually, where you can see emerging industrial hubs where you're getting sort of clusters of CCS projects, and you can think about the policies to support them, but also the economics of the offtakes. That's where I think you can sort of start to get some success. So I think it's that need to think about uh, yeah, the supply and demand dynamics, the the costs, including the fully loaded costs, including the transport, and also thinking about that cross sector and across different industries, the collaboration that's needed to make these technologies scale.
But I guess, as I mean, slightly at a tangent, but the electric vehicle market, one of the major problems seems to be building out the charging infrastructure from scratch. And I'm thinking, say, with hydrogen, I think am I right in saying in the States they've got a reasonably well developed sort of hydrogen supply chain, but in the UK and Europe perhaps not. So it's that much more challenging to start with a blank piece of paper and build out the whole infrastructure as opposed to a region or a country where they've already got some level of distribution. Is that fair to say?
I think that's absolutely right. I think it is thinking about where does infrastructure already exist? Where are there pipelines that already exist? Where are there transport and storage hubs? And making it a success there. Because the whole thing with the energy transition is that for any one location, there's actually going to be a different mix of technologies that will be the right solution for those locations. And it's trying to sort of uh, take that approach whilst also keeping a sort of global and regional mindset as well. So it really takes this mix of very local thinking as well as then recognizing that we are part of a global energy system.
Again, in terms of the renewable developers, they're clearly experiencing growth, similar to what we mentioned earlier for utilities, but there's regulatory uncertainty, tariffs, permitting challenges again for them. Um, are there particular challenges for I guess, both the boards and the engineering teams in terms of uh, going out to sort of pursue aggressive renewable expansion, but also keeping some kind of, I guess, commercial discipline at the same time, or can they kind of keep both of those equally well served, if you like?
Yes, I think there have been challenges at the project level. So at the macro level, there is a clear need for renewable capacity to continue to be built out. And actually often when you look at the capacity build out so far, it has often exceeded historical forecasts. So it has been growing very strongly. However, when you take that to a project level, the project level economics are often really struggling. And this is a mix of, as you said, there's regulatory uncertainty, there's challenges with inflation and the supply chain, tariffs, permitting, etc. I think what's become clear is that you kind of need to take the investment case and think about all the different levers that you can pull. So some of it is around the operational levers, for example. So there's a lot more effort going into the installed base of renewable technologies, thinking about how can there be enhanced condition monitoring, for example, to really focus on the OPEX. There's also thinking about what's the right revenue model for the offtakes, uh, to what extent you should be tied up with PPAs, exploring corporate PPAs, and thinking about the revenue stack and how to make that as sort of successful as possible. And then I think for any one renewable developer, it's thinking about what sort of geographical exposure they want to have and how can they get a little bit of geographical diversity to reflect the fact that they need to any one country will go through ups and downs, but if there's sufficient geographical spread, then hopefully then you can find the pockets where there's high growth and supportive development environments.
Okay, and I think the report you highlight solar storage and onshore wind as major opportunities. Are there any particular factors or yeah, approaches that are required to make sure that project execution is as successful as it can? I mean, how much can they control as opposed to what we just you mentioned there? Obviously, we talked about permitting tariffs, so that's kind of semi outside of their control. So what sort of things do the folks need to be doing to optimize the chances of getting, successful project execution?
Yes, I think there's something about that early stage, and as you said, some of it's outside of your control, but thinking about the grid connections and storage and what that sort of overall package looks like really early on is important. I think there's a lot of effort into how can how can data be used as a real capability? What are the advanced analytics? Now, some of that again is at the front end, thinking about the site choices, but some of it is around the operations of the assets and the maintenance, for example. Um, I think there's also then thinking about where possible, where can scale be of benefit? Where can you get standardization um, in terms of the developments? A sort of modular approach is proving very popular, particularly if there's um, customers, in the data center world, for example, where you can sort of think about how to scale up efficiently. Um, but it's certainly it does take the developers that have got a lot of experience are certainly winning because they're able to uh, feel more confident in their ability to get the value from these projects, and so they're able then to win on the price upfront.
And gas, I think, is seen as still being essential for reliability, and increasingly, certainly, I know from conversations with data center folks, it's being used as a complement to intermittent renewables. How are organisations balancing that, investment in gas infrastructure with sort of decarbonisation, sustainability? And is there any suggestion that sort of all the, using this gas as a sort of easy option rather than uh, clearly in the short term it's needed, but do you get the impression that people are sort of relying on it rather than maybe looking to go further with their sustainability and renewable objectives?
Yes. Yeah, gas is a really interesting question because I think there's definitely clarity that it is going to play an important role uh, for likely a long period of time. However, I think that there is an acceptance that if you take the whole lifetime of a turbine, the role may well change. And I think it you have to think about these assets under a number of different scenarios. So our clients who own and operate gas assets are really thinking very hard about a world where the capacity factors go way down and they're used essentially for flex gen rather than an always on sort of base load. So thinking about is there a way to make that economically viable is quite important when considering a long-term investment in these assets. There's certainly pockets where you're seeing strong load growth. Gas is becoming an even more important part of the equation. And actually, there are some challenges with that supply chain as well. The lead time for the build out of gas turbines has really extended quite far. So there's nothing that is able to quench the thirst of the data centers as quickly as it is needed. But it is seen, gas is seen as an important role, particularly to bridge whilst the grid capacity catches up.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned earlier on that the behind the meter gas solutions are expanding for that that data center market. But before the just something occurs to me as well, whether you're happy to talk about it or not. But I mean, small scale nuclear, the government made a big announcement with Rolls-Royce, I think, is in Anglesey and stuff. But again, as I understand it, we're talking mid 2030s before it becomes available. So, although it sounds quite exciting, there's quite a long gap between sort of the theory and the practice. Is that a fair summary of that technology?
Yeah, it is. It is a fair summary, and I think this is what's so interesting about the energy transition at the moment is that you've got some very short-term requirements of the energy system today, and you also have this need to invest in technologies that will be the core energy technologies of the future, and all of this needs to happen at once. So yes, nuclear isn't going to solve the things in the next at least 5 years. But that's not to be said that it's not important for those investment decisions to be made. And I think it's certainly something that we see national governments sort of do struggle with this a bit because there are pressures on energy prices, energy security today. And they're also having to make decisions to future-proof the energy system for decades to come.
Yeah, and I guess we can't have a conversation about energy and certainly technology without mentioning the two letters AI. It seems to be everywhere at the moment, and clearly it has a role to play when it comes to energy management. Uh, and I guess, as with many other sectors, we're moving from sort of projects, trials, experimentation to starting to see operational use. Do you have any ideas as to what sort of promising applications you've seen, whether it's sort of predictive maintenance, performance analytics, and any advice to folks in terms of how to go about deploying AI in when it comes to energy management?
Yes, yes. I think it it's absolutely critical, and adoption is moving very quickly. And I think it's helpful to remember just how sophisticated some of our large energy players are. So, the global oil majors are already very far along in terms of using analytics for predictive maintenance and asset monitoring and these sorts of areas. I think for utilities, uh, one of the biggest challenges for utilities is energy demand forecasting and demand side management. And that's where we see one of the strongest use cases for AI adoption in the survey that we did. I think the other area is around the end customer as well. So whether that's pricing or service or customer experience, there's also a lot of opportunity there for AI to sort of improve that. I think where AI adoption is being most successful is where there's a clear value lever. So if they can clearly get an ROI linked to either a reduction in OPEX or better reliability due to better demand forecasting, then it really takes off because you start to see the benefits immediately.
Yeah, in the study, I think it said as much as 80% of executives expect substantial AI value within the next 10 years. Um, I'm just interested as to whether you've any thoughts as to the expectations of the reality, because I think a lot of reports I've seen about AI, the actual projects that have come to fruition, yeah, there's been almost a reverse of that. Sort of say 80% of people have been disappointed in the projects that they have run so far haven't been effective or delivered what they thought. So yeah, I suppose what I'm trying to say is there, do you think, a disjoint between the optimism about what AI can do and so far, if you like, the reality as to what it has delivered, or is that not right?
I think it is right. I think so. Yes, our survey, which said 80% expect to get value within 10 years, but I think only half are seeing that today. I think some of the roadblocks come back to, unfortunately, some of the basics around data quality, the infrastructure around that, as well as the people side of it. How do you operationalize this? How do you undertake change? How do you make sure you've got the right expertise? And some of these are challenges that these organizations have faced for a number of years, and it's just now really coming to light. I think um, where we see sort of success is where there's focus on scaling a use case where the benefit is really clear. So either it's a critical sort of bottleneck or a critical problem for AI to solve, and then sort of taking that across an organization. I think also where there's a lot of successes in how to have some level of centralization, particularly whilst this is new and fast growing, but then making sure that the execution is really out there in the field. So rather than either completely decentralizing it or completely centralizing it. And I think the other thing is about, and it's something that is true across so many areas, but measuring the impact is really important as well. So I think it's certainly not easy, and yes, it can't be taken for granted that it will deliver value. It could actually sink a lot of investment if it's not done carefully.
Again, in terms of the sort of slightly looking ahead, I think the study says that practical constraints are going to continue to shape energy transition strategies. So I guess we're back to the sort of decarbonisation and operational reliability. I mean, I don't know whether it's right to present them as sort of opposing sort of objectives, but they're maybe not always closely like. So how can, or any advice to senior leaders in terms of prioritizing the ways in which they can address both decarbonisation and operational reliability, into the future?
Yes, I think to start with, finding the areas that address both is going to lead to a number of no regrets actions. And one thing we should remember from an environmental perspective is that any short term reduction in carbon emissions has got a very long lasting impact on cumulative emissions. So if you think about sort of emissions over time, anything you can do to bring that curve down in the short term is much better than waiting till right towards the end towards your targets and then coming down very late. I think, unfortunately, for sort of branding and marketing, a lot of these choices are quite boring. A lot of it is around discipline and around efficiency and around cutting waste. The good news is that those measures will typically have a carbon benefit and a cost benefit at the same time. And so that's where anything that could be done over a sort of 3-5 year horizon is worthwhile. I think it's also important to try and, whilst doing that and whilst being pragmatic, I think it's worth also being idealistic and recognizing that the end state here is that the energy system does have to transform, and we do need to continue to think about how can technology and other advancements, how can they help accelerate that transformation? How can we keep in mind the end goals and work towards those as well?
And maybe just finally, in terms of government strategy, whether UK or anywhere else, I mean, is there any places that you think are doing this transition particularly well? And also, does it concern you at all that there often seem to be mixed messages? So nobody quite knows where they stand at any one stage, or they think they're heading in a certain direction, and then suddenly, I won't say the brakes are slammed on, but there's some kind of change going on. I mean, I do work in the water industry, for example, and there seems to be some, rowing back there on commitments around biodiversity and stuff. So just are you worried, I suppose, that the presentation of, it's either sort of business or the environment is still kind of crudely underpinning rather more decisions in the energy sector than perhaps it should be, or is that an unfair characterization?
Yeah, I think it is odd in a way when it's sometimes I see it's sort of either environment or the economy, which I don't think is right because ultimately we're trying to create sort of long-term viability of and avoiding economic chaos, right? So I don't think these two should be seen as opposing. I also don't think that the environment and people should be seen as opposing, as we're sometimes seeing as well. That actually, this is really about protecting the environment for us to enable to thrive within it and to have a a sustainable place for us to work and live. So yeah, the opposing views and the idea that this is a zero-sum game, I think is not right, actually. I think in terms of, I don't necessarily see any country or any government that's got it all solved. I think it's interesting to see that you are getting technologies scaling where you've got economies that are fast growing and perhaps you're still getting growth from access to the grid as well as modernization of it. They're obviously less encumbered by the history and the historical investments that have been made. And so they're able to, in some ways, sort of leapfrog to more efficient energy systems. I think there are tangible examples that are quite specific about where countries have done good things to overcome a regulatory constraint or they've put in place a strong policy. But I think we're also seeing a lot of wavering, and the challenge with wavering is it becomes very hard to make investment decisions if there is uncertainty. So that's one of the key challenges. So I think it is about, ultimately everyone hopefully is trying to work towards common goals around the economy and society and environment. And instead of seeing it as an either or, if it could actually be seen as, what are we striving for, and how can along the way, how can we get that combination of energy security and affordability and decarbonisation. All of them are important.
And perhaps just finally, because you give me a lot of your time, for which I'm very grateful. But do you think the pace of change? Do you get worried about the pace of change? But I mean, again, back to data centers, the predicted expansion of the data center industry alone is, I think they're going to double or even treble the amount of energy they consume, and they're already consuming, is it 2% of global energy or whatever, and it's predicted, I think, to get to 6 or 7%, maybe even. So, bearing in mind that expansion, and I'm sure in other areas as the digital world continues and electrification is an objective. Do you foresee potential significant disruption, shall we say, in energy supplies in certain parts of the world, or do you think everybody's kind of on course at the right pace to make sure those things don't happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's really easy to feel like everything's slowing down. I think if one thing can be true for forecasts, they things tend to happen slower than you expect, and then they'll happen faster than you expect. And I think whether it's electrification due to load growth, or whether it's innovation from some of the sectors that are helping to drive the energy transition, I think it's unlikely to just be a narrative around it going slower than we want. I think it's likely to be slower and faster in time, and it's just making sure that you can kind of adapt to that as quickly as possible and hope that we can make sufficient progress.
Excellent. I'd say thank you so much for the time you've given me and some brilliant insights into what's clearly a fast-moving, quite complicated scenario, but it's fascinating to watch how it is evolving. So, Bex, really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.